Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for signing on for our second NOFAS Advocacy webinar, setting the stage for 2018. I'm looking forward to going over all of this with you. We're going to give it just 1 or 2 more minutes to make sure that everyone can sign on. All right, thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to join me for this webinar today. We're going to talk about a few different things that you should find useful heading into our next election cycle, as well as just in general as advocates on the issue of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. If at any time something is unclear to you, or if you have any general questions that don't get answered during this webinar, please go through GoToWebinar and submit a question. You can also feel free to email me at cameron@nofas.org, or you can contact NOFAS for any other questions related to FASD. So, without further ado, we're going to be examining a couple of different things today. But first of all, in the last webinar, we went over the different types of Hill staffers that you might interact with in a congressional office. This isn't absolutely essential information, but it's helpful. We also covered communications best practices. I strongly encourage reviewing the last webinar. We do have it posted online, and anyone who can't easily find access to it, feel free to email me and I will send it right over to you. So, as I mentioned before, you can submit questions at any time through GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar. So first of all, we're going to be discussing Calquiz. Now that's a tool that is used very regularly to find out which congressional staffer you want to be talking with at any given time. That's because basically all of the information about who staffs what issue in a congressional office is available to you at any given time, but not many people aggregate it. So Calquiz is a paid service that aggregates this information, but you don't necessarily have to go around trying to purchase access to it. Often other organizations will provide it for you. So there's a simple way to go into Google and get Calquiz results, and we're going to go over that right now. So first of all, you want to type in the name of the elected representative you're trying to reach at the federal level. In this case, I'm using the example of Senate Majority Whip John Cornyn of Texas. So we just type into Google Calquiz John Cornyn. The results we get from that will look a lot like this, and I highlighted the one that I click here. A variety of different organizations, purchase access to Calquiz. You can see AMVETS here. You can also see votehemp.calquiz.com. I chose just the top one here. So we get a page that looks like this. It's very narrow, and you can see biographical information, contact information for the office. You can even see information about their political action committee, which is the way in which they raise money. What we're going to click on is staff. So this is a very simple way to go through and find out about all of the staffers within this office. If we wanted to talk to John Cornyn's office in DC, and we actually wanted to have a substantive discussion with a staffer from that office, we would go to staff, and then we would look up the health legislative assistant, whose name is Beth Nelson in this case. And as you see on the screen here, we have a formula that's used across the entire House and Senate for staffers' emails, and that that changes slightly between the House and Senate, but it's a pretty simple thing to do, and unless there are hyphens or a name is incredibly long, it usually works. If you can't get that information about the staffer that you're looking for, you can always try a different staffer. So in this case, you know, we'd first want to talk to Beth Nelson, but if we couldn't get in touch with that person, we can see that child and family issues are handled by Claire Sanderson, as well as education. So Claire Sanderson probably has some sort of perspective on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders because it's, you know, so significant in the education system, and it's very significant as a family issue. So, you know, that's a relevant thing to talk about. If you're looking to talk about foster care or about IDEA, you would want to talk to the person handling education. But if you want to talk about, you know, the healthcare cost associated with living with FASD or something along those lines, you'd want to talk to the person responsible for health in the senator's legislative portfolio. The important thing to remember about contacting legislative staffers is if you have a good interaction, or if you have any interaction, you want to follow up and let them know how much their time meant to you. You know, these are public servants, and a little courtesy and a little kindness goes a long way, but it's also helpful to build relationships and, you know, have a relationship that they can refer to in regard to their understanding of the issue of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. So if you're looking to contact Congress and you really want to get, you know, into a conversation, not simply receive a form letter back, you can do best by utilizing Calquiz in the way that was covered so far and contacting the most relevant staffer. So the next thing I want to discuss is issue campaigns. Issue campaigns are basically something you can do as an advocacy organization, or, you know, as an individual. You can even spearhead an issue campaign to, you know, let the public know about something that's important here. So this can have to do with state issues, this can have to do with federal issues. Obviously, there is a massive difference in the scope of each of these, but you can be effective as an advocate doing either. So, you know, there are a number of tactics that go into issue campaigns: action alerts, collective action, like phone banks, or, you know, even petitions or social media. There are communications priorities that you should always integrate into an issue campaign. We went over letters to the editor and opinion editorials that really help build awareness. You know, you can get published very easily that way, and there are a lot of people who sit and read and get involved in causes because they read about it in the paper. And, you know, always be sure to let NOFAS know if you're looking to spearhead an issue campaign related to this, especially on the federal level. We're always happy to provide any support we can, and we do have a lot of resources that are helpful in communicating about, you know, this very unique set of disorders. So the other option you have running an issue campaign, if you have the resources, is paid media. You know, things that are going to cost money to send out, but you can send out paid mailers, radio spots, and we're going to get into more detail on that a bit later. But for now, we want to discuss the 2018 election. That's going to be a midterm election. Midterm elections historically kind of reflect some resistance to the in-party That's something that, we understand when Democrats are in power, in control of one or both houses of the legislature and the executive branch. Republicans are going to do better in a midterm election for the most part, and the same would reasonably apply in this case, that the in-party is the Republican Party and that Democrats are poised to do slightly better in a midterm election because the in-party is always, facing difficulty, and the out-party is always facing some frustration. So Democrats and Republicans are going to be courting voters across the country, and they're going to be doing it not with the charisma of individual people running for president, but they're going to be focusing on specific issues, especially legislative issues that have come up recently into the public zeitgeist. One of the main ones is the opioid crisis. And if you were unaware, NOFAS has recently expanded its mission statement to include prenatal exposure to controlled substances, and under that falls neonatal abstinence syndrome, which is something that's being discussed increasingly more often as it pertains to the opioid crisis. So that's just one example, but there are a lot of different issues that will really get discussed, and voters will be considering quite often how these politicians affect those issues, as opposed to whether they stand with the president or against the president a lot of the time. Candidates for open seats are going to need to build their name recognition, and incumbents need to look like they're connected to their constituents. So it's an excellent opportunity to check in with the people that represent you, and doing that on the political as opposed to the official side is advantageous for a few reasons, largely because it goes into a different audience than you would be getting from contacting your senator or congressman regularly. A campaign pays to reach a lot of people with their communications, and if you can integrate your cause, your experience or your organization into an election communications piece, you'd be able to reach a lot of people. Now, naturally, in the nonprofit world, you want to stay nonpartisan. In fact, you have to stay nonpartisan, but that doesn't mean that you can't disseminate information to these people competing to be part of the government. As long as you're not endorsing anyone, but you put out positions that you believe are favorable to fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and those affected by them, you're going to be doing something that isn't partisan but does raise awareness. So from that, local media is going to be profiling candidates for different levels of office. There are a lot of ways that you can insert yourself into that if you keep up a relationship with a campaign. And community organizations, very often host forums and debates between candidates. Often these are strictly nonpartisan organizations, and that's why people trust their moderation of these events even more closely, because they don't have a stake in who wins. They just want to see these issues discussed. There are great examples of that, in the context of a debate hosted by the Chamber of Commerce. That's an organization that can be partisan, but they most often hold these events, and people trust debates hosted by different municipal chambers because of the fact that they know they're going to be discussing the issues that are important to business owners in the area. So how to use 2018 as an individual. Town halls and forums, as I mentioned previously, you should utilize every chance to go to one of those, because it presents you the opportunity to talk to a lot of politicians and candidates without a media filter between you. You get to ask your question directly. Everyone in the room hears that. Everyone on TV or radio gets to hear that, and their responses become part of the dialogue of that election. that's something that you should absolutely take the time to figure out when they'll be and where they'll be, and even if you can get involved in any way. Online interactions are another excellent opportunity in the age of streaming, especially as people are live streaming events with regularity. You have an opportunity to ask your representatives questions while they're right on the line. This happens in the middle of the day all the time. If you look at a candidate's schedule on Twitter, or where they say they're going to be next, often it's a radio show in the middle of the day. And there's nothing wrong with that, but not as many people call into radio shows in the middle of the day when you're working. So, take off a couple minutes to call in and ask and explain a bit about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and say what your concerns are, ask how they plan to address them. Ask to meet a candidate. If you are an advocate and you believe that your story should be important to them running in this area, you should contact the campaign. Most campaigns are happy to talk to people who could one day tell a good story about how their issue was positively affected by the person who was elected. But remember, throughout all of this, you don't need to take a side. You don't need to endorse anyone. In fact, you really shouldn't. You should just take the time to utilize this environment where people really care, about what our government is going to do, to talk about, how that's going to affect fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. So, raising awareness as an organization or collective, you want to be enterprising, in short. There are a lot of different ways that you as an organization can insert yourself into the media narrative happening in your state and in your county. Challenger candidates and candidates for open seats always want to debate. They want to debate a lot more than other candidates often do, because they want to boost their name recognition. They want to be heard talking about different issues. They want chances to appeal to voters. So hosting an issue-specific event will definitely pay off in spades. If you choose to host a forum about the opioid crisis, it will undoubtedly generate some interest. The key to that is to make sure that your operations are airtight. You want to send invitations early and often. That's to say, you want to get as many of the announced candidates to confirm their attendance at the event, and you want to make sure that their schedulers know all the details very early on. And that includes a large set of questions that you might not be initially prepared to answer. That's why you want to contact them early, especially when they're, the larger the campaign it is, you're going to find that staffers are going to be more and more concerned about more and more specific details. But as you get to the local or state level, you really have an opportunity to talk to these people and, have a greater license on what you do with the event. So there are some potential ideas put down here. Even if you're doing a fundraising event, if you make it one where people can advocate or have tables or represent their organizations, that's a good idea. You want to get as much participation and as much involvement from these groups as possible, and there are a lot of ways to do that. If you think that NOFAS can help you in any way with that kind of work, please don't hesitate to reach out. The other thing is you want to make sure that you're interacting and that you're putting the work into interacting. So social media is an excellent way to go about this. You want to have a Twitter for your organization. You should have a Facebook page for your organization, and you should use these public artifices to show your support for statements that reflect a good understanding of the issues associated with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. You should also make sure that you're putting out original content that people can look at and share and consider. So, one way to do this is look at how Medicare affects the people who, are affected by FASDs or their families. Look at how changes to Medicare might affect the ability to receive treatment. That's something you can write a simple blog post about and share out there, and you can tag 2 different candidates in a link on Twitter and say, I hope you won't support cuts to this program or that program. The one thing that I would caution you with this sort of behavior is don't use it negatively. Don't go after any individual people over decisions they're making. That won't reflect well on your organization, and it won't appear impartial, which you always want to be. You want to really focus on the issues, and you want to focus on whether or not a stance is good, not whether a person promoting a stance is good. When in doubt, reach out to campaign staffers themselves. I found when running a campaign before, when an organization is willing to interface with me and discuss how my candidate is going to be featured in their materials, if we put the effort into, really talking more and more about the issue, when you actually take the time to talk to campaign staffers about how the work your organization is doing on a communications level will affect their efforts, they'll be very happy to consider your invitations to really look into trying to get their candidate to talk more about the issue of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders when otherwise they might not. So, the way that can look is simply emailing the information account at a campaign, or simply calling the general line and saying, I represent this organization, we have an event in the future, we'd like to discuss, your participation in it. Email's usually best, but if you're having a lot of difficulty reaching someone, it also doesn't hurt to visit an office from time to time. So from there, we have to consider tactics associated with grassroots organizing. Not everything you do during 2018 needs to rely on the presence of a candidate for office. Phone banking is an excellent way to promote an issue campaign. You can get together a bunch of people to volunteer and organize an event around a potluck, and then call legislators in a really systematic way to make sure they know your opinion on anything specifically related to fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. When doing this, once you reach a high enough threshold in terms of calls, a lot of offices will notice, when I've been in the U.S. Senate, we would sometimes create form letters simply because people were persistent enough to keep calling us, to talk to us about this issue that we didn't know anything about beforehand. Leading staffers to educate themselves is a great way to get something done. But also, when there's a piece of legislation that a senator or congressman or state representative or state senator might be totally indifferent to, you need to make sure that they understand why their constituents are affected by it and why it's important to them. And if you're the only one talking to them about why they should take one stance or another, then the likelihood your voice is going to be the one that prevails is much higher. So that's the general benefit to doing something like phone banking, to doing something like creating a petition. Other ways to organize through grassroots is social media. Once again, live streaming events where you have politicians present or where you have, a lot of people present really shows your clout. Allows you to share your organization's work. I don't think I need to tell you about how massively impactful viral trends are, especially in this day and age. But it's it's one of the fastest ways to grow your base of supporters. Email blasts are another excellent method for fundraising, for outreach, for organizing. You should be always building your email list. You want it to get longer and longer, and you want to make sure that you are utilizing it, but only to the extent that you need to keep people involved, and you don't want to become a nuisance. So, an email blast refers to a mass email to your entire list. You can use a lot of different clients for that kind of contact, and we'll go over a few. Sending out a personalized newsletter, getting one every week that says, Phil, we wanted to let you know what NOFAS has been doing this week, and just a bulleted list of different events, some photos. People, having a presence online is incredibly important, and doing that with your email list is good as well because it can keep people engaged. So fundraising is another way you can utilize email blasts. You can always frame the way that one piece of legislation may affect your ability to advocate as an organization, or discuss how certain decisions that have been made in the executive branch of your state or federal government are going to affect your organization. You want to be able to raise money off of important events in such a way that you contact your list and say, if you can contribute to our cause, we will have a greater capacity to affect change on this. Obviously, if you don't have any plans to affect change on a piece of legislation, don't try to raise money saying that you're going to try and affect change on that piece of legislation. I think that goes without saying, but you'd be surprised. So, creating, organizing, and mobilizing a constituency. Before you're ever collecting names for an email list or for an outreach list for volunteers, you want to make sure that you have a very concise record that doesn't have you contacting one person twice, that doesn't have you contacting all 3 emails for one person every day, and to keep up to date information. So I see it's not Failsforce, it's Salesforce. Salesforce is a well-known platform that allows you to do this, as well as keep a lot of other records and databases in sync. MailChimp is a very easy way to go about it, mostly for email. And Nation Builder is another option available to you to really mobilize a constituency. And Nation Builder does just about everything. I can highly recommend that service. It's also very cheap for its purposes. It's used by a variety of different organizations, but started as a campaign tool. So, in order to utilize a database most effectively, you obviously want to make sure you're very familiar with all of its functions. And the best way to do that is, then asking me, would be to, choose the one that suits your needs, and then contact the organization, the company that produces it, because they are highly invested in making sure that they expand their user base and that their products are effective for the people that pay for them. There's an enormous amount of competition in that department, so I strongly encourage you to do your own research when searching out a client for a database or something similar. So expanding your constituency you want to make sure that you're collecting names every time you go anywhere, collecting business cards. You want to build a really strong Rolodex, and that's largely just being proactive as an individual. But you also want to make sure that your design is intelligent. When you have a website, you want to have sign-up buttons with a hyperlink to a form that will allow you to collect information from people that includes, email, phone number, and zip code or address. You want to make sure you have the same links and that this is consistent across your Twitter, across your Facebook page, across all of that on social media. Cohesion is very important, both to people who are evaluating, the ethos of a nonprofit organization they want to help out with, but also in order to make things much easier for you. And then mobilizing. Essentially, you want to have events available. When someone seeks out an organization, they ask, what does this organization do? And you tell them through photos, through written text, but another way that you can really display that you're active and useful is to have an event on the books so that people know, there's a way that they can apply themselves and show up and be useful. A way to get people to go to events is food. If you're going to ask volunteers to do work for you that is unpaid, but still can be hard work if you're calling tons of different congressional offices within your state or state offices. Offer several pizzas to the people that show up, and it makes an enormous difference. Remember that your volunteers are not just tools. They're people who are really passionate about this, maybe as passionate as you are, and enticing people to spend their time on this kind of work is important. Going from there, once you've got a constituency, you want to make it useful, and that's by being in touch with them, by making it clear that your organization is useful for what you're trying to talk about. And another way to do that is to make yourself an important source of information. So action alerts are one of the best ways to do that. One of the main criticisms of American government is the fact that we, spend a lot of time on campaigns, but we often don't understand what legislation is actually passing through Congress, through our state governments right now. There are a lot of easy ways to track news coverage through Google alerts or anything like that. There aren't a lot of easy ways to track legislation, but you'll find that it's not as hard as you think it is. When you go to your state government website, when you go to congress.gov, all of these things, can be very useful to you. And when you find something that needs attention, a piece of legislation that must not pass, or a piece of legislation that, that really needs to be considered, then you want to be able to reach out to your wider network, organizations that work with you, people that volunteer consistently, people that like Facebook posts regularly. It doesn't matter how involved they are, send out an action alert to them, post it on Facebook and on Twitter to make sure people understand what their government is doing. If they see your organization as an authoritative source for what's going on, it makes you invaluable. So I think that it's always useful to develop the infrastructure pursuant to having action alerts. And you use email blasts to send out action alerts. You utilize social media. You want all of these things to work together to really develop your presence. And this is something that works better during a federal election year, a midterm or presidential election year, than any other year, because people are so tuned in, because people are thinking about the issues that really matter to them. Tools like Nation Builder can be really useful for this. in particular. That's also because they can send out automated phone calls if you utilize those kinds of services, or they can even send out automated text messages. I was working on a campaign in Louisiana, and I went out to knock doors the night before the election, and someone answered and said, "Oh, I was just texting this candidate for U.S. Senate." They believed they were texting the candidate when it was in fact, you know, an automated outreach program that was texting them, and a volunteer was talking about that candidate's you know, positions on various types of policy. I don't recommend you impersonate anyone through text message. That's not a good idea. But utilizing it to create, you know, a more intimate relationship with the people you want to reach out to can be useful. Just, you know, use your discretion to realize what sort of outreach is appropriate for your constituency. So the next thing I want to discuss is paid media. I'm going to take just a moment, go to webinar, went into the corner there. Okay. So, paid media is different than everything we've gone over before. This is because, you know, letters to the editor, op-eds, social media, you don't actually have to pay to reach people on any of those things. But social media is unique in that you can pay to reach more people. That would be considered a form of paid media. Though when people talk about paid media, they more often refer to mailers, TV ads, radio ads, and you have to spend different amounts of money to make this kind of communication worth doing. Because if you are unable to, you know, break through, as it's called, into a population with your message, you're basically just putting noise on the airwaves that might reach one or two people. But if it doesn't reach enough people for them to talk to each other about it or for it to stick in their memories, you know, it doesn't become useful. So paid media is always, you know, something that you have to weigh as a decision, as an organization, and as an item to spend something on. Now, an example I put up here is Prop 8 in California, which was, you know, over same-sex marriage, had enormous amounts of money spent by both sides to influence the popular vote on whether or not same-sex marriage would be legal in the state of California. So, you know, businesses, churches put lots of money onto either side, and you know, that's a great example of how an issue campaign really started to mimic a lot more like a regular political campaign and utilized paid media to a massive extent. Now, if you were just trying to influence the city council, it would be a lot easier to just send out, you know, a paid mailer to almost everyone in town. But there are some considerations to each kind of paid media you're going to use, because every medium is going to affect things differently. So radio or TV is useful because you can, you know, get in touch with the average person, and it's relatively easy to target depending on where you are. The difficulty there is that you really still can't choose who you're targeting, and it's highly expensive, and you have to spend a lot of money to make it worth it, as I mentioned earlier. Now, digital refers to basically social media, online advertising. It's incredibly inexpensive, and you can target people down to so many specific characteristics that you might actually find it somewhat concerning. This can take the form of the ads you see on Facebook, or the Google results you see at the top before the actual results from what you search. There are a lot of different ways to buy digital ads, but one of the easiest ways is to promote a Facebook post. Promoting a Facebook post, as I'm sure you've heard in the context of the most recent presidential election, is very inexpensive, allows you to reach a lot of people, and allows you to reach a lot of people with very specific interests. So you'll be able to use these different platforms to spend money and get people to start seeing your materials. The problem there is that we're all constantly bombarded with digital ads whenever we do anything online. And if you think about how many you click, it's not a lot. But, that's not going to get people on the streets or on the phone as much as, personally interacting with them would. So paid calls is another method of paid media. You can actually hire firms where they have, hundreds of people phone banking for you all the time with programs that allow them to target people, that allow them to, never be wasting time dialing. This is a great way to promote specific events. I often find that I get official calls from my state representative from my old neighborhood in Philadelphia that say, please come to my next public forum, next week. And I still get them. I don't have a Philadelphia area code. I don't remember giving that information to anyone, but I'm constantly informed about my state representative's next attempts to reach me there. And, on one hand, that can be bothersome, but on the other, if I still lived in that constituency, I'd be really happy that, that one of my representatives was taking the time to do that. Similarly, if I were to support, a nonprofit organization trying to do advocacy on neonatal abstinence syndrome, and I found out that there was, going to be an informational panel and lunch next week, via voicemail, I'd definitely consider it more than if I saw an event pass by me on my Facebook newsfeed. So, the problem with paid calls is that you can't use them, for anything that requires really critical thought. Paid callers will do their best, but don't expect them to be as passionate about this issue as you are. So when you're choosing to invest in paid media, you need to select vendors. You have to select generally a business that specializes in this. And I can tell you, as someone who has received appeals at NOFAS on different campaigns from many different vendors, lots of people will aggressively try to contact you to tell you that they'll do the best job and the cheapest. The key there is just to shop around. You need to get as many quotes from as many different people as you can. But ask for sample work. Try to get a sense of their body of work and their client base so that they can be useful to you. If it's a firm that does paid media for ExxonMobil, they probably don't know a lot about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. If they do exclusively campaigns, they probably don't know as well how to communicate about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. You want to make sure that you're investing in people who are going to take the time to understand what you're trying to say. For a website, if you as an organization or as an individual advocate don't have one yet, I can recommend Wix and Squarespace highly as cheap methods to purchase domains and host a website. They're very easy to design with, without any sort of knowledge of code. You'll often run into vendors for different kinds of paid media who will try to charge you hundreds or thousands of dollars for a website. And that's generally not a necessary expense. If you have the money, go for it, but there are other ways to spend it. You know, vendors will always try to upsell you on the next thing. That's consistent across many different kinds of business, but when it comes to you know, vendors for paid media, you want to make sure that you're only buying what you need. And there's no reason to spend hundreds of dollars on a website you could design in a couple hours for much less money. Printed materials is, you know, one of the main methods of paid media, going through mailings, going through you know, yard signs, yes on Prop 8, no on Prop 8, for instance, very common. In my neighborhood in DC, we actually have tons of yard signs about the construction of a bar at the end of the block. People utilize them for even that. Pamphlets, banners, all of that, you know, paid media printing. And when you're printing and you're communicating, especially with Democrats and with union workers, you want to make sure that you have a union bug. And there's a photo right here of what a union bug looks like. It goes in the bottom, usually the bottom right-hand corner of any sort of printed material, and it just indicates that that those materials were made with union labor. Members of unions will not help you if you try to hand them signs or anything that doesn't have a union bug on it. That's something that's more serious in some states than others, but I can tell you that I've seen multiple examples of that. But for printed materials, absolutely shop around. Make sure that you're not, you know, paying too much for postage. There are usually special nonprofit rates for mass postage like that. So that's those are just some of the best practices for paid media. We've gone over a number of things today. You know, getting in touch with your elected representatives via Calquiz, one of the easiest ways to reach out to these people and actually talk to someone who works on these issues. We discussed 2018, the general environment that you're going to be seeing out of different campaigns and people seeking office, and how that's going to affect the way they address issues. Organization being essential to a successful grassroots effort. We've gone over the ways that you can build cohesion in your online presence, and ways that you can raise awareness without a lot of difficulty, you know, financially, through things like town halls or local events, or just trying to meet with these different groups. And, you know, mainly knowing that you can utilize technology for all of its advantages, and that you can always be shopping around to make sure that you're getting the most for your organization. Now, moving forward, if you have any questions for me, for NOFAS, about where you can start with all of this, if you want to start on any of this, we would be happy to help you. So always feel free to contact me at cameron@nofas.org, or go to information@nofas.org. We're usually very attentive to you know, any concerns related to advocacy. We want to make sure that you can utilize the next year as best as you can to really get people to understand how important this is, because we're all aware how significantly FASDs affect this country, and how intimately they're related to the opioid crisis that's being discussed. I hope that this has been useful for you, and that this might have fostered some ideas on how you can make yourself as an advocate or your organization more productive in the future. I received a question about whether this webinar will be available later. it will be uploaded to YouTube, and we will disseminate a link to that video. Thank you all so much for taking the time, and we'll see you for the next webinar. We hope to do another one in this sort of series. We'll get more and more specific. So hopefully we can build a deeper understanding of advocacy and what makes it effective over the next few months. Thanks so much, everyone.